In our last story, we ended with a lesson, a promise that we'd never stay silent again. But tonight, we go deeper, beneath the headlines, beneath the outrage, into the mind of the man who silenced her and the system that almost let him walk free. If you thought Kitty's screams were haunting, wait until you hear what he said afterward. I didn't think anyone cared. Winston Moseley, 1964. Winston Moseley was 29 years old when he killed Kitty Genovese. By day, he was a married man, a father of two, and a machine operator. By night, he became something else, something he himself couldn't explain. During his trial, he sat quietly, emotionless. He didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't plead, just stared, as if the world around him was something he'd already given up on. Before this, newspapers reported crimes with cold detachment. After Kitty's murder, journalists began exploring human psychology, asking why instead of just what happened. This case didn't just spark outrage, it sparked reflection. And from that reflection came one of America's greatest moral awakenings. Citizens began forming neighborhood watch programs, emergency training groups, and advocacy for victims' rights. For the first time in modern America, people began to say, "We're responsible for each other." But decades later, another truth emerged, one that complicated everything. Investigative journalists re-examined the case and discovered that the original 38 witnesses' story may not have been entirely accurate. Some witnesses did call the police, some did shout out. The media, eager for shock and moral outrage, had exaggerated parts of the event, but by the time the correction came, the damage was done. The narrative had already become legend. Kitty Genovese wasn't just a victim of murder. She was a victim of a story too powerful to control. You see how stories twist over time, how silence and distortion feed each other. That's why these cases must be told, so truth doesn't die twice. Subscribe now, and don't let the next Kitty Genovese vanish into history. Half a century later, her name still appears in textbooks, documentaries, and lectures on ethics and social responsibility. But here's the haunting part. Every generation since has had its own Kitty Genovese moment. Every year, new headlines surface. Woman attacked on subway while commuters watch. Teen beaten as bystanders record. Crowd films tragedy instead of helping. It's the same silence, repeating itself under a new sky. That's why this story isn't history, it's a mirror, and every time you look away, it reflects you. If you've ever scrolled past injustice online and told yourself, "It's not my fight," think again. Kitty's story lives every time good people stay silent. Subscribe, speak, share, because one voice can stop the next tragedy before it begins. So the next time you pick up your phone and dial 911, remember, that sound, that signal, that help was born from silence, and the silence was born from fear. Kitty Genovese didn't die in vain. She became a voice that never stopped echoing. The world didn't just lose a young woman that night, it gained a conscience. If you hear a cry in the night and your heart hesitates, remember her name. Because the cost of silence is always blood, it's haunting to think how soundless that night truly was. Not just in terms of noise, but in the absence of human reaction. Kitty's screams did echo. People heard them, but they were absorbed by the walls, muffled by hesitation, diluted by the illusion that someone else would act. One man, Robert Moser, a neighbor, did shout from his window, yelling, "Leave that girl alone." And for a fleeting second, the attacker paused. He retreated into the darkness between the apartment buildings. Kitty, bleeding and dazed, managed to crawl toward the safety of her apartment building entrance, just 30 yards away. But minutes later, as the windows closed again and the night grew still, the attacker returned. And this time, he made sure she couldn't scream again. The man, who would later be identified as Winston Moseley, a 29-year-old married father of two, finished what he started right there in the stairwell of the apartment building, and for more than half an hour. He came and went, while 38 people remained behind their curtains, watching, listening, frozen. What could make an entire community choose silence over action? Was it fear, apathy, or the chilling comfort of believing that someone else will do it? This became the dark heart of what psychologists would later call the bystander effect, a term born from this very tragedy, and one that would forever haunt the conscience of society. When police finally arrived, it was too late. Kitty Genovese was already dead. The officers were met with quiet faces, uncertain voices, and a collective confession of passivity. Neighbors admitted they'd heard the screams. Some thought it was a lover's quarrel. Some didn't want to get involved, and some simply assumed someone else had already called for help. Imagine that. A woman dies in plain sight, not because no one saw her, but because everyone did. That's the part that unsettled America to its core. It wasn't just about the murder. It was about what it revealed, that beneath the comfort of city life, humanity had quietly developed a coping mechanism for fear: detachment. You see, New York in 1964 wasn't like today. It was a place where danger felt constant, where crime was an accepted background noise. People had learned to look away, not out of cruelty, but self-preservation. But Kitty's death forced everyone to question, when does protecting yourself become the same as abandoning someone else? In the days that followed, headlines screamed not just about the murder, but the witnesses. The murder witnessed by 38 people, and no one called for help. The story became a mirror, showing us something far more terrifying than one killer's act. It showed us our own capacity to do nothing. Now, imagine being one of those neighbors, the muffled sound of a woman's plea echoing through your window, your hand hovering over the phone, your heart pounding, arguing with itself. It's not my business, someone else will handle it. But that voice inside doesn't fade. It stays with you, long after the sirens come. In the next part, we step into the mind of one of those witnesses, the quiet observer who saw everything, and would spend the rest of their life trying to forget the sound of Kitty's final scream. I still hear her sometimes, the sound of her scream. Not like in movies, not high-pitched or rehearsed. It was raw, like someone realizing, too late, that help wasn't coming. That night, I was sitting by the window, a cup of coffee in my hand, watching the streetlights flicker over Austin Street. It was past 3 a.m., and then I heard it, a woman's voice, a cry that sliced through the quiet. I froze. I didn't move. I just listened, because at first I thought, no, it can't be what it sounds like. Not here, not right outside my building. Then came the second scream, this time clearer. Please, someone help me. I remember setting my cup down and going to the window. I looked out, and I saw two figures under the street lamp, one small, one larger. There was movement, a struggle, but then someone across the courtyard shouted, "Leave her alone." And just like that, the bigger figure slipped into the darkness, and I thought, okay, it's over. Someone scared him off. She's safe. So I closed my window. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe less. Then the sound came again, but softer now, more desperate, like someone crawling. I didn't go back to the window. I told myself, someone must have called the cops already. Besides, what could I do? I didn't even know what I was looking at. I didn't want to get involved. I didn't want trouble. That's what I told myself. The next morning, there were police cars everywhere. Yellow tape, reporters. Someone said a woman had been stabbed. And when I saw her picture in the newspaper, that's when my stomach dropped. Her name was Kitty Genovese. She lived not far from me, worked at a bar in Hollis. Everyone said she was kind, always smiling. and I realized I'd heard her die. You want to know the worst part? I wasn't the only one. There were dozens of us behind those curtains, in those apartments. Some watched, some just listened, some pretended not to. We all waited for someone else to act. Someone else will do it. The most dangerous sentence in human history. They call it the bystander effect now, but I call it what it really is. Cowardice dressed up as confusion. You tell yourself you didn't know what to do. But the truth? You didn't want to do anything. Because doing something means involvement, means risk, means you can't unsee what you saw. And so we let her die. Every night since then, I walk past that same alley, and I swear, I still hear her voice, not loud, not accusing, just asking, "Why didn't you help me?" I never have an answer. When the story broke, the world was horrified, not only by the murder, but by the silence. It became a national conversation, a mirror reflecting the rot beneath our social comfort. How many times do we scroll past suffering, ignore a cry for help, or turn down the volume when someone's pain is too loud? The Kitty Genovese case became more than a crime. It became a psychological warning, one that would change how society viewed responsibility forever. But the story didn't end with silence, because from one woman's death came a movement, one that reshaped emergency response systems, moral education, and even how 911 was born. If you believe you would have done something different that night, prove it. Hit subscribe, because silence might just cost another life. The morning after Kitty Genovese's murder, the New York Times published a story that shocked the conscience of a nation. Headline: 37 who saw murder didn't call the police. Later corrected to 38, but the damage was already done. America couldn't stop asking the same question. How could this happen? How could an entire neighborhood watch a woman die and no one step in? At first, the story seemed simple. A monster named Winston Moseley stalked a woman. He attacked her once, ran away when someone shouted, then came back to finish what he started. It was evil in its most ordinary form, but what haunted people more wasn't the killer. It was the silence that surrounded him, because when Kitty screamed for help that night, her voice bounced off dozens of walls, reached dozens of ears, and died in the air. In police interviews, some neighbors said they thought it was just a lover's quarrel. Others said they were too afraid. One woman said she didn't want to get involved. One man admitted he picked up the phone, then put it back down. Each of them carried a piece of guilt. Each of them became a mirror for the rest of us. We didn't just investigate a murder, we investigated human nature. We knocked on every door, asked the same question: why didn't you call for help? The answers were horrifying in their normality. People assumed someone else already had. That assumption killed her. Psychologists and sociologists took notice. They studied the case and coined a chilling term: the bystander effect, a phenomenon where the more witnesses there are, the less likely any one person is to help. It exposed something buried deep inside society's comfort. That responsibility is often the first thing we abandon when danger enters the room. But Kitty's death didn't vanish into silence. It transformed it, because out of guilt, shame, and national outrage came reform, a wave of civic and legal awakening that changed the very way Americans respond to emergencies. Before 1964, there was no universal number to call in an emergency. If you needed help, you dialed your local precinct. If you even knew the number, Kitty's murder became a case study in bureaucratic failure. How could dozens of people want to call the police, but not know how? So in 1968, the 911 system was born, a single simple number that anyone could remember, a direct line between panic and help, a bridge between fear and action. Kitty's case also influenced what would later become known as Good Samaritan laws, legislation that protects people who try to help others in emergencies. Because one of the biggest fears that night was, what if I get involved and make it worse? What if I get blamed? These laws flipped that fear on its head. Now helping wasn't just safe, it was legally protected. It was the system's way of saying, never be afraid to save someone. Her death reshaped how psychology viewed morality. It forced scientists to ask, why do good people do nothing? Universities across the world began studying group psychology, responsibility diffusion, and empathy paralysis. It wasn't just about crime anymore. It was about human conscience. And soon those studies were woven into police training, crisis response, and even public education campaigns. The goal? To remind everyone watching, silence kills. From one woman's last cry for help came the birth of systems that saved thousands every day. Kitty Genovese didn't die in vain. Her name became a lesson, a legacy, a whisper that reminds every one of us, be the one who calls. She screamed like they all do. I didn't stop because nobody else did. That one sentence froze the courtroom because it wasn't just about the killing. It was about what he saw in us. He didn't just exploit Kitty's vulnerability. He exploited our silence. He believed the city wouldn't stop him. And he was right. Psychiatrists later described Mosley as a high-functioning psychopath, intelligent, articulate, and chillingly self-aware. He claimed he killed not out of hatred, but out of curiosity. He wanted to see what it felt like. He told the court that night he had simply gone out looking for someone alone, someone weak, someone who wouldn't be saved. And when he saw Kitty step out of her car under that lonely streetlight on Austin Street, he decided she was it. He followed her, watched her walk toward the entrance of her apartment, and then struck. The first attack wasn't fatal. She screamed. She fought. He ran when a man shouted from a window, but then he saw the lights turn off again, and he came back. When he returned, Kitty was lying by the side of the building, trying to crawl toward the safety of her apartment door. She was bleeding, terrified, whispering for help. He knelt beside her, and in his confession, he said he looked into her eyes before finishing what he started. That single detail broke the jury's composure. Because he didn't run in rage, he walked in confidence. He knew no one would come. During his sentencing, Mosley shocked everyone again. He described the murder with a kind of eerie detachment, as if he were describing someone else's memory. When asked why, he simply said, "It was just one of those things people do." The room went silent. Even the judge had no words. He was sentenced to death. But here's where it gets darker. His sentence was later reduced to life in prison because the state of New York abolished the death penalty shortly after. Meaning, Winston Mosley, the man whose crime gave birth to America's 911 system, lived long enough to see it work. He once told a prison psychologist that sometimes, in his dreams, he still heard the sound of her calling for help. "It's not her voice that wakes me up," he said. "It's the silence that follows. If that silence chills you, hit subscribe right now, because the next scream you ignore could be real." In a strange twist, Mosley became a case study for prison rehabilitation programs. He earned a college degree behind bars. He wrote essays about guilt, morality, and responsibility, one even titled "The Apathy of the Bystander." He described himself as a reflection of society's indifference. And while it disgusted many, others saw something even more terrifying: a mirror of us all. When Winston Mosley died in prison in 2016, he'd spent more than 50 years behind bars, one of the longest-serving inmates in New York history. No family came to claim his body. No one visited his grave.